So we will focus on, for Chapter 15, the bureaucracy of the federal government. So the learning objectives will be discuss the unique features of the American federal bureaucracy, explain the evolution of the federal bureaucracy, summarize how the federal bureaucracy functions today, and discuss checks on and problems of the federal bureaucracy. Summarize how the federal bureaucracy functions today, and discuss checks on and problems of the federal bureaucracy and the possibilities for reform. So, a bureaucracy is basically a complex, specialized, and formal hierarchical structure of people and departments designed to get stuff done. Basically, they're the ones who are responsible for the nuts and bolts of decrees, legislature, and orders. You'll find this in the public and bureaucracies in both the public and the private sector, and bureaucrats in the government at least are appointed and not elected. So the American bureaucracy is unique in the fact that the political authority is shared among several institutions, between and the fact that the executive and legislative branches both control the federal bureaucracy. Basically, the lines of control are pretty dotted; they're pretty blurry. The federal government's agencies also share functions with state and local governments, like for example, how the FBI often collaborates with local police agencies in order to find criminals. You also have a very adversarial culture, of close scrutiny, media leaks, court cases, and rights advocates constantly pestering the bureaucracy. The U.S. government also owes less of the economy, but regulates it more tightly. You also have a lot of in the federal bureaucracy. You have a lot of also outsourcing. For example, grants and aid to states with Medicare. Lots of outsourced work to corporations and private employers, the income tax collection withholding. You also have many military duties that are contracted with private companies, food contractors in Iraq, as well as security, as well as private military corporations in Iraq. You also have non-government organizations. Now the advantage is that this is flexible and that it looks like government size is being contained. It basically, and the fact that it hides full-time equivalents of the actual federal bureaucracy. However, there are disadvantages. For one thing, accountability can be an issue because sometimes those contractors are not very reliable or can screw things up. Most famous example would be the Blackwater fiasco in the Iraq War, where the operators got killed and quite publicly. So in the beginning, Congress barely agreed the president could fire bureaucrats. Basically, this was a way to prevent the president from just firing anyone he didn't like. The appointment of officials was dominated by this was because the appointment of officials was dominated by Congress in the 20th century. Sorry about that. That just came up. This was because the appointment officials were dominated by Congress until the 20th century. So basically, Congress wanted to have control over the federal appointing of federal bureaucrats because they knew this would be useful for patronage. This was often focused on rewarding local supporters. Congress now patronage has become less and less of a thing now, but Congress still has the power to purse and as well as statutory and oversight power when it comes to the federal bureaucracy. And this tug of war between the executive and Congress over the control of the bureaucracy continues to this day. Originally, the federal bureaucracy had a service and not regulatory role. As the laissez-faire government oriented towards states' rights. However, over time, the federal bureaucracy had a dramatic change. Especially during and after the Civil War, World War I, Great Depression, the New Deal, and World War II. These were the two big things that really expanded the power of the federal government and the bureaucracy. The Cold War, 9/11, with the creation of the Cold War with increased defense spending and increased power to the intelligence agencies. The 9/11, again, more power to the intelligence agencies, with the Patriot Act, as well as the fact that the creation of the Department of Homeland Security with 2008. financial crisis, coronavirus, and basically any other catastrophe that comes along our way. The Supreme Court very grudgingly okayed Congress, Congress to delegate rulemaking to bureaucrats in the 1930s. With the Great Depression going on. The number of federal employees today is stable at 2 million, but it's estimated that 13 million people now work indirectly for the federal government, basically as part of the outsourcing that the federal government, the feds often do. Discretionary authority is also has further increased. Basically, the bureaucrats themselves are given more power. Some have called the federal bureaucracy almost like a fourth branch of government because they are the ones who can control whether or not presidential policies are actually enacted effectively, or if they're just stalled. They also have control over regulatory law, and sometimes the bureaucracy has quasi free branch power, as they can make the laws, execute them, and judge them. So this is basically a little diagram when it comes to the government of the United States. As you can see, it is quite complicated. This is just mainly because, over time, the United States has become more and more active in the world's affairs. So, you kind of need a lot. And as well as the fact that things like the Great Depression have demonstrated the federal government needs to be actively involved in people's affairs, people's affairs. Otherwise, things go to crap. In terms of recruitment and retention of bureaucrats, the Pendleton Act of 1883 switched staffing from patronage to merit-based. The civil service exam is used for 54% of the staff, down from 86% in 1952. This is mainly because exams don't really work well for specialized and white-collar professionals. Also, affirmative action-ish efforts have been implemented because, in order to increase the minority representation of minorities in the federal bureaucracy. The rank and file bureaucrats is quite representative of the country as a whole right now, so that's a plus. The accepted services also don't use exams. 2,000 jobs are still presidential patronage and political appointees. The buddy system or name request is pretty strong, basically social capital of LinkedIn. The old boys and girls network is also very much present, Firing a bureaucrat is now as hard as firing a teacher. So, bureaucrats often develop an agency point of view. Most are politically liberal and believe in government. Can't really say you can be surprised, because if you're working for the federal government, you want to make sure it works. You're trying to make it work, not trying to actively, reduce its power. They can and sometimes do sabotage their politically appointed bosses, especially Republicans. However, most act professionally, and it's not really what we call, and it really doesn't constitute a deep state. Now, you have an important aspect of the federal bureaucracy is something called the Iron Triangle, which illustrates the complex relationship between the congressional committees, interest groups, and the bureaucratic agency, with through mutual back-scratching, like funding, favors, and political support. So this is basically this is how it works. Basically, Congress can provide funding and political support to the bureaucrats, and the bureaucrats can effectively execute the actions of Congress. Interest groups provide, electoral support to congressional candidates in exchange for federal legislation and oversight. Interest groups can lobby for bureaucracies and provide them congressional support. In exchange, the bureaucracy offers low regulation and special favors. Now, due to the growing number of interest groups and the subcommittees, iron triangles have been really replaced by interest networks, as there are multiple interest groups like congressional staffs, universities, think tanks, media, White House, etc. I mean, this is just an example when it comes to healthcare. There are so many people who get involved, like the president, pharmaceutical companies, health organizations, federal agencies. The American Medical Association is a very powerful lobbying group in terms of healthcare. If you're ever wondering why universal healthcare was never a thing, you can really blame these guys and the pharmaceutical companies. So this is just like a map of locations of top 20 lobbying firms by first quarter 2010 expenditures. as you can see, like many of them try to like put their offices, near the president's, near the White House, as well as like near the White House, and within driving distance of the Capitol. So, in terms of congressional oversight of the bureaucracy, power of the purse is primary, as they are the ones who control the amount of money a bureaucratic agency receives. The authorizing or legislative committee starts things off and sometimes have budget control of bureaucratic entities via annual reauthorizations. The powerful appropriations committee sets annual budgets for most others, and however, some budgets are protected by trust funds, for example, Social Security, and which the spending is automatic based on the number of people who are entitled to these benefits. Now, the legislative veto is often used to micromanage the bureaucracy. However, this was ruled unconstitutional in the 80s since it cuts the president out. Now, the congressional investigations and hearings are key tools, and it can subpoena people and send them to jail for contempt of Congress. This acts as a push against executive privilege. Now, there are issues that you see with the federal bureaucracy, like red tape, like basically issues of regulation, conflict, basically. Federal bureaucratic agents poaching on each other's power, duplication, which one bureaucratic agency does the same thing as another one, imperialism, which federal bureaucratic agencies become quite powerful, and waste. However, and this has led to an overall low. This has led to a lot of people like not liking bureaucracy in the federal government in general. However, interestingly enough, people have a pretty high opinion of many federal bureaucratic agencies, as well as federal workers themselves, with the notable exception of the IRS. Big surprise. Why? Because they are the ones who collect your taxes. Now, it's quite possible that things like the CDC have decreased because of the recent coronavirus outbreak, as this is quite old. It's from 2013. So there have been attempts to reform the bureaucracy, like a push for centralized efficiency, the first Hoover Commission, and the Ash Council. You also have a push for responsiveness and accountability with Al Gore's Reinventing Government initiative, improving procurement a bit. Bush's performance assessment rating tool has basically failed in terms of management by objectives effort. Now we have to think: do we really want to change Now, some people might argue, do you really want to change the federal who controls the bureaucracy? As this may make the bureaucracy too powerful, and a weak and divided bureaucracy may help protect liberties, despite causing all sorts of headaches. So that was pretty short. Thank you for watching.